Hello, my name is Faith Phillips, and I am the Director of Student Financial Services at Central Ohio Technical College and the Ohio State University at Newark. This presentation is regarding the financial aid process for the 2022-2023 financial aid year. We are going to begin by talking about the FAFSA, and the first letter of FAFSA stands for free. There are websites out there in which students can file the FAFSA form for a fee. These sites are not affiliated or endorsed by the U.S. Department of Education, and you should not be using these sites when filing the FAFSA form. Do not pay to submit the FAFSA form. You will want to make sure that you're using ED's website. The free application is a standard form that collects information about the student and the parent, and it determines how much eligibility the student has for financial aid, which is funds provided to the students to help pay for their educational expenses. The FAFSA collects information about the student and the parent and calculates out what is called the expected family contribution, or EFC. It is a measure of the 2020 taxable and untaxable income and current assets, again, of both the student and the parent. Other factors in the expected family contribution include the size of the family, the number of family members in college, and other demographic information such as marital status and the age of the older parent. Colleges use the EFC to determine the student's financial aid eligibility, how much they're eligible for, and from what funds. Students who are seniors in high school right now will be filing the 22-23 FAFSA form for the academic year 22-23. That FAFSA will become available October the 1st of 2021. Please note that a student must reapply for or resubmit the FAFSA every year. The earlier a student or parent files, the earlier they will receive a financial aid offer and the more aid they may potentially be offered. So the student wants to make sure that after October 1st, they submit that FAFSA as soon as possible. Especially for incoming freshmen, we know that students and parents want to make informed decisions about the colleges they're attending, and they want to see the financial aid offers from all of the schools. So the earlier a student and parent submits their FAFSA form, the earlier they will receive a financial aid offer. Many colleges and universities use what we call financial aid filing priority dates. And we use those to get students to file the FAFSA as early as possible, again, so we can have offers out as soon as possible, but also to maximize their eligibility. We have funds of money that are limited, and we tend to offer those to the students that meet those FAFSA filing priority dates first. The admissions process and the financial aid process is connected in most cases. And what I mean by that is many colleges and universities will not look at a FAFSA application unless it has an admissions application to match up with it. So for example, you can submit the FAFSA starting October 1st, and you can list up to 10 colleges and universities on the first submission of that application, even if the student has not applied for admission to a college. However, that college may not bring that FAFSA into their student management system and evaluate the student's eligibility for aid until it has an admissions application to match up with it. So we don't discourage students from adding colleges and universities on the FAFSA when they submit it, but understand you may not hear from that college until they have received your admissions application. The sources of financial aid include the federal government, states, colleges, universities, employers, and private resources. The federal government is the largest provider of financial assistance of all federal, of all federal grants and student loans. The states also have financial aid. So for the state of Ohio, the Ohio Department of Higher Education has state grants that students may be eligible for. And the FAFSA form is the only form that is needed to apply for all federal and state aid. Colleges and universities also have their own sources of funds, including scholarships, some that are merit-based, some that are merit and need-based, and some that are simply just need-based grants. Then you want to check with your employers to see if they may have funding sources for your dependent children. And then other private resources may include local foundations, other scholarship searches that you may apply for scholarships through. Never pay. In addition to the financial aid form, don't pay to submit, but you also don't want to pay for any scholarship searches. So for most of this presentation, we will be referencing the FAFSA form on the web, and we encourage all families to use the FAFSA on the web versus a paper application. The FAFSA on the web has built-in edits that prevent you from making certain mistakes that could be costly errors. It has skip logic built into it that allows students and parents to skip unnecessary questions that may not pertain to them. You also have the option on the FAFSA on the web to use what is called the IRS data retrieval tool, and it allows you to give permission to the FAFSA site to go to the IRS site and pull your tax information directly onto the FAFSA form. And it only brings over from your tax return exactly what is needed on the FAFSA form. Also, more timely submissions if you submit it electronically. Very detailed instructions are provided on the FAFSA on the web, and a simplified process in future years. So remember, I said you do need to reapply for financial aid each year. So after you created a student record and submitted a FAFSA for this year, next year when the student logs in, it will pre-populate the student's FAFSA information with the demographic information that typically doesn't change. It can be updated, but it will carry that forward from year to year. And then all you have to do in the next year is update it with the next tax year's information, the current asset information, and submit the FAFSA. Prior to beginning the FAFSA form, we encourage all students and parents to request a federal student aid ID. The FSA ID is the electronic signature for the FAFSA form, and it's used by students and parents throughout the financial aid process, including those subsequent school years when you reapply for financial aid. If you ever have to go in and make a correction to the FAFSA, you will use the FSA ID to access the FAFSA as well as to sign it. If the student or the parent chooses to borrow a student loan or a parent loan, the FSA IDs are used to electronically sign the student loan promissory notes. Only the owner of the FSA ID should create the FSA ID. So each student should go in and request their FSA ID, and then one parent whose information will be provided on the FAFSA form should request their own FSA ID. So if the student's parents are married, both parents' information goes on the FAFSA form, but only one of those parents needs to provide an FSA ID to electronically sign the FAFSA. If you ever have multiple children in college at the same time, each student must have their own FAFSA form, and each student must have their own FSA ID. And then the parent uses their same FSA ID for each child that they submit an application for. This is a screenshot of the FSA ID application. So you log into here, get started. You identify the student by name, social security number, date of birth. Provide an email address, not their high school email, since those tend to be deactivated when the student graduates. And you may only use an email one time. So when you provide an email address, it will send an email to you with a code to take it back to authenticate that email address. Then provide a mobile phone number. Again, you can only use a mobile phone number at one time. You provide that number, it will send a text to that mobile phone, give you a code that you take back to the FSA ID application to again authenticate the user. The student and the parent will then create the username and password themselves, and they will answer a series of security questions. We encourage all families to write down the username and password that they have created, as well as the answers to the security questions. That way, if you're ever locked out of the FSA ID, you know the answers, you know the username and password, and you can access that information. The FSA ID is not year specific. So the FSA ID can be requested prior to October 1st when the FAFSA goes live, so that you already have that taken care of prior to entering the FAFSA application. To ensure that you are not on a FAFSA paid site, you are encouraged to go to the website studentaid.gov, which is the home page for all things student financial aid. When you click on studentaid.gov, you will see at the top the different options. You will click on apply for aid, and that will take you to the complete the FAFSA form link. For the first time entering into the FAFSA, you will click start here, identify the student with their username and password, and that will open up the FAFSA form and begin the process. It will save your FAFSA information as you enter it throughout the FAFSA process. If you have to close the FAFSA down and go back to it and finish it later, it is saved there on the secured website for you to reaccess. The next time you go in, then you will click log in using the student's username and password, and that will give you access to the FAFSA. When logging into the FAFSA, you can choose to be logging in as the student, or if you're the parent completing the parent portion, you can click that you are the parent. When you log into the FAFSA form on October the 1st, there will be 2 academic year FAFSAs displayed at the same time. There is a 21-22 FAFSA, which is for the students who are currently enrolled in college. They can apply for financial aid up through June of next year. Then the 22-23 FAFSA will be added October the 1st. Please make sure for seniors in high school, the 22-23 FAFSA is the application that you will be completing. Mistakes to avoid when filing the FAFSA, clearly making sure that you submit the correct FAFSA year. So again, seniors in high school in most cases will be filing the 22-23 FAFSA form. Make sure when applying for FSA IDs and when completing the FAFSA form that you use the student's and parents' legal name as they appear on the Social Security card. When the FSA ID is created and when the FAFSA is submitted, the applications go up against the Social Security Administration database to make sure that the students are who they say they are and then it's verified. So do not use any nicknames on the FSA ID or the FAFSA application. Again, making sure that you know those financial aid priority dates or deadlines for the institutional funds. You want to make sure that you meet those dates. Most colleges and universities have dates that are typically in the first part of the year, and some schools do not have a priority date at all. However, there are some schools that have priority dates in November and December. So you will want to make sure before you start the FAFSA form that you have verified for all of the schools that you're sending the FAFSA application to, that you know all of their priority dates, if any, and that your FAFSA is submitted by the school that has the earliest priority date. Make sure when you're typing in digits and numbers that you aren't inserting extra digits or you're not transposing numbers. Make sure, of course, that the Social Security number and the date of birth are accurate. Making sure that you submit the correct parents' financial information, and I will discuss here in a minute who the parents are for the purposes of the FAFSA form, and what to include for investments and net worth. We will talk about that as well. On the FAFSA form, it will ask the question, are you male or female? And when the answer is male, the student is presented with the selective service information. Most males are required to register with selective service upon their 18th birthday. This used to be a requirement for federal student aid eligibility. This is no longer a requirement, but the question is still presented on the FAFSA application, but the answer to the questions do not impact financial aid eligibility. If the student is 18 and has not registered with selective service, they can click yes to the question, or excuse me, you can click no to the question, are you registered with selective service? And you can allow the FAFSA application to send an application to selective service to register the student. Either way, all males should make sure that they comply with this requirement upon their 18th birthday. So even though it is not a requirement for financial aid purposes anymore, it is in the state of Ohio a requirement on the registration side at public universities. So students do need to make sure that they comply with the selective service requirement. The federal government's philosophy is that parents have the primary responsibility to pay for their dependent child's education. And so the FAFSA form defines who is a dependent for financial aid purposes by presenting the student with a series of dependency status determination questions. Answers of no to all of the questions will determine the student to be dependent, and parents' information must be provided. And answer yes to any one of the questions, the student is independent and does not need to provide parent information. The first question will be pre-populated with the answer for the student based on their date of birth. And in general, students are considered dependent for financial aid until they turn 24, or they are married, or they are pursuing a master's or a doctorate program, or if they have children who will receive more than half of their support between the year July 1 of 22 and June 30 of 23. So for the academic year. So if the student has a child of their own and they are providing more than 50% support for that child and will continue to provide that support, then they will say yes to that question and it will make them independent. The same thing if it's not a child or a spouse, but someone else who lives with them that they provide more than 50% support for and will continue to provide that support, they can say yes, and it will make them independent. Then it will ask the student if they're in active duty or a veteran of the armed forces. A checkbox there automatically makes the student independent. Then it asks the student, at any time since you turned 13, were both your parents deceased, were you in foster care, or were you a dependent ward of the court? A yes answer there or a checkbox there makes the student independent. Or if the student, as determined by a court in their state of legal residence, is an emancipated minor, that would make them independent. Or if the student has a legal guardian, not legal custodian, but a legal guardian as determined by a court, that would make them independent. So if the student says no to the previous questions and cannot check any of the boxes in this section, it will automatically determine them to be dependent for financial aid purposes. Then the student will be presented with another set of questions that will ask them if they were homeless or self-supporting and at risk for homelessness. And if they say yes to that, it will ask them if they can obtain documentation from a homeless liaison or a homeless shelter. If they say none of the above, they may still go ahead and say yes to being at risk for homelessness and move forward, and it will make them independent. Any yes questions to legal guardianship, foster care, or homelessness may be verified by the college or university where the FAFSA is sent. So if a student says yes to those questions, the student should be prepared that the college or university may reach out and ask them for documentation for those circumstances, just to make sure that the student answered the question correctly. If the student cannot say yes to any of those questions, but they are still unable to provide parent information on the FAFSA form, they still have another opportunity to check the box that says, I'm unable to provide information for my parent. And then it takes them to the next slide and it explains special circumstance options. So if they do not live with their parents and they're not receiving financial support from their parents, they're abandoned by their parents, there's an abuse situation, something that's unusual, the student can say, I have unusual circumstances and I'm unable to provide parents information. They can move forward as an independent student, and they will not be presented with the parents' information on the FAFSA form. And the FAFSA will be submitted and sent to all the colleges and universities listed, but it will not have a calculated family contribution. So when the colleges and universities receive a FAFSA with the special circumstance box marked, the college and university will reach out to the student and ask them to explain their circumstances. And if warranted, then the college may override the student status and make them independent based on their documented circumstances. Circumstances in which we cannot do a dependency override are simply not living with the parents not providing support, the parents refusing to submit the FAFSA form or provide their information on the FAFSA form, or not claiming them on their tax returns. So the student must have some documentable unusual circumstances, such as abuse, abandonment from the parent, in order for a dependency override to be considered. Examples of those special circumstances would include both parents being incarcerated, a student left home due to an abusive environment, students are estranged from the parents, or the student does not know where their parents are and are unable to contact them. A student with these special circumstances, as I mentioned, may submit the FAFSA without parents' information, and they will work with the colleges to determine if their circumstances, once documented, makes them independent. And if the college finds the circumstances are acceptable, they will update the FAFSA to override the status. So we will move forward with the assumption that the student is determined to be dependent, and they will provide parents' information on the FAFSA form. So who is the parent then for the purposes of the FAFSA form? It is only the biological or adoptive parent that may provide information on the FAFSA form. Foster parents do not and guardians do not. If the parents are not married, but they are living together, the student would still report the information for both parents. If parents are divorced, the student would provide the information for the parent that they lived with most in the last 12 months. And if they didn't live with one parent more than the other, the parent who provided the most financial support during the last 12 months or the most recent year in which support was received is the parent that would file the FAFSA form. If that parent is remarried, the step parent becomes the other parent for the purposes of the FAFSA form. So this is the only exception to the biological or adoptive parent requirement. So if the parent that is providing the FAFSA information is divorced but remarried, their marital status would now be married, and the step parent's information becomes the other parent's information on the FAFSA form. This is what it looks like on the FAFSA form. The student will determine who is parent number 1 and who is parent number 2 for the purposes of the FAFSA form and provide the information for the appropriate parent in each section. The FAFSA, based on how the student is answering questions, is beginning to calculate the household size. So it knows if it said the parent's marital status is married, that there are 2 parents, and it knows that it needs to include the student. So at the minimum now we have 3 in the household. Then it will ask for the number of your parents' other children, even if they do not live with the parent, but the parent will provide support for them, or they would be considered dependent for financial aid purposes. So the student would then enter the number of other children in that box. Then other people, if they live with the student's parents and the parents provide more than half of their support and will continue to provide that support during the financial aid award year, which is the 22-23 year. So it will total up then the number of people in the student's household size. Of that number of people, how many of them will be in college? And you do not include parents. So if a parent is also in college at the same time, they do not get to include themselves in the number in college. The FAFSA will then ask under the student section and under the parent section for 2020 tax information. We encourage all students and parents to use the IRS data retrieval tool if they filed a 2020 tax return. This allows certain tax information to be taken from the IRS database and put into the FAFSA information. This is not a requirement. The student and parent can choose whether or not they want to transfer the data to the FAFSA on the web. The IRS will authenticate the taxpayer's identity, and if the tax record is found, IRS transfers the information onto the FAFSA form. This reduces documents that may be requested by the financial aid office, as many financial aid offices will be verifying the information provided on the FAFSA if the student is selected for a process called verification by federal student aid. If the student and parent do not use data retrieval and they're selected for this process called verification and they're requested to provide 2020 tax documents, if they use data retrieval, that's one less document that they would have to provide to the financial aid office. There are certain tax filers who cannot use data retrieval tool. And an example would be a parents that file married but separate cannot use data retrieval because the system cannot add together the information and put it onto the FAFSA form. Anyone can attempt to use the data retrieval tool. It will present you with a series of questions. And if you answer yes to those series of questions, it will tell you that you're ineligible to use the data retrieval tool. If the student filed a 2020 tax return, you may also use the data retrieval tool on the student's tax return. So when you are in the income section, it will tell you that it is faster and easier to use the data retrieval tool. You can click the box that says link to the IRS, and it will take you over to the federal income tax information. And even though it says 2019 on this screenshot, it is actually the 2020 federal tax income year that will be used for this. If you do not wish to use the data retrieval tool, you may click the little blue link that says no thanks, and it will take you on into the FAFSA questions that will ask you for your tax information. In the question, if you go to the help, it will tell you what line number on the tax return you can find the answer to the question on the FAFSA form. Once you have answered the questions for both the student and parent under the income, it will now ask for the net worth of investments. And unlike the taxable and untaxable income, which is based on the 2020 tax year, net worth of investments is as of today. So as of the date that you are submitting the FAFSA form. And this question is asked under the student section as well as under the parent section. And it will ask, as of today, how much do you have in cash, savings, and checking accounts? You add together what all of those are and you plug that figure into the FAFSA form. Then it will ask you in the investment business farm value section, it wants to know the current or market value minus any debt, and that's the net worth that you will be reporting. What you do include as investment is any real estate other than the home that you live in, trust funds, money market funds, mutual funds, CDs, stocks, bonds, and commodities. Also included are education savings plans, such as the Coverdell 529 or refund value of prepaid tuition plans. If the parent is the owner of the education plan and the student is the beneficiary, the asset is listed under the parent. If someone other than the parent is the owner, for example, grandparents have opened the 529 plan in their name, they are the owner and the student is the beneficiary, and it does not get reported as an asset on the FAFSA form. If the parent owns more than one 529 plan, so if you have multiple children and they each have their own 529 plan, you must include the value of all of the accounts that are owned by the parent on this FAFSA application. Now, keep in mind that even though you report a dollar figure here in net worth and cash savings and checking, not all of that is considered available to be used for the student's education. There is an asset protection allowance that is applied against the amount that you have reported on the FAFSA form. So the FAFSA doesn't look at the amount you reported and says that amount is available. It protects a high percentage of it. Only a small percent is put into the calculation of the EFC. Assets that are not included on the FAFSA form are, again, the primary residence that you live in, the value of any life insurance plans, the value of any traditional retirement accounts, so PERS, STIRS, 401ks. Do not re-report any cash savings and checking that you've already reported in the question above. If you own a business or farm with 100 or fewer full-time equivalent employees, you do not report the value of your business or your farm, and you do not report the value of any family farm that you live on and operate. When you are in the FAFSA application and you're in the asset section, go to the help section and it will reiterate what is included as an asset and what is not included as an asset on the FAFSA form. You are now ready to tell the FAFSA form what colleges and universities you would like the form sent to. You can list up to 10 colleges and universities on the first submission of the FAFSA form. So if the student is looking at more than 10 universities, you will want to pick the 10 that have the earliest financial aid priority date and submit those on the first transaction of the FAFSA form. Once the FAFSA is processed, the student and the parent are notified that it has been processed and sent to each school. The student can then log in and add up to 10 more colleges and universities on another submission of the FAFSA form. If you've listed 10 and you go in and you need to add more schools, you will basically be removing a school from the school section. This does not notify the school that you've removed that you've added another school. Colleges and universities cannot see the other schools that you have listed on the FAFSA form. So it does not matter if you bump a school off, and it does not matter what order you list the schools in on your FAFSA application. So you can do a search by state, or you can search by university, find the school that you want, click it, and then you can go on and add more schools until you've selected up to 10 on the first submission of the FAFSA form. For each school that is listed, you must select an appropriate housing plan from the drop-down list. And the drop-down list will include on-campus, off-campus, or with parent. So do the best you can for each college that you've listed to list what you believe the housing plans will be for the student at the time that they enter college. Once you have entered all of this information in, you are now ready to sign and submit the application. So the student logged in with their username and password. All they have to do is read the fine print and agree to it and click sign the FAFSA with the FSA ID. And then you will provide the parent signature for the parent that requested the FSA ID. So you'll look down to see which parent's social security number and date of birth are selected. You'll click provide parent signature. You'll type in the parent's username and password for their FSA ID. You also have an opportunity at this time before you submit it to view or print the FAFSA information that you have entered. This is a good thing to do to make sure that you have entered all of the figures properly and that you've not transposed numbers. If you find that you made a mistake, you can go back to the top where you see the tabs where it says student demographics, school selection, dependency status. You can go to the section that you need to correct before you submit the FAFSA form. And then more important than anything is to make sure that you actually submit your FAFSA by clicking the button that says submit my FAFSA now. Once you have done that, a confirmation page will pop up and tell you, congratulations, your FAFSA was successfully submitted to federal student aid. It will provide the date and time in which you submitted it, and give you an idea of what happens next. It will also at this time give you an expected family contribution estimate so that you can see what it thinks your EFC will be. If that EFC determines that the student would be eligible for a federal Pell Grant, it will indicate that also here on the confirmation page. And it will also display the direct loan estimates that the student would be eligible for. All students, regardless of parents' income, are eligible for federal student loans. We don't want students to take out loans that they do not need, but every student will be offered, in most cases, a federal direct student loan to help pay for their college expenses. Also on this confirmation page, you have a one-time opportunity to transfer parent information to an application for a sibling. So if you have twins, for example, you would do the FAFSA for the first student. Remember, they need their own FAFSA and their own FSA ID. And then when you're at the confirmation page for student one, you will click this button that says, does your brother or sister need to complete a FAFSA? And it will open up a FAFSA for that student that will carry all the parents' information over. Then you enter that second student's FSA ID, username, and password. It will identify that student, and now you add the income and asset information for that student, and now you're ready to submit it, and it speeds up the process. If you ever have two students in college at the same time, do the FAFSA for the student that is already on file first, because you'll be doing a renewal application for them and there's a little less data entry there. Then click this link and it would open up the FAFSA for the next student. But once you close the confirmation page, you use that link and you now need to just start a new FAFSA and you'll have to enter all of the information in. Once the FAFSA is submitted, it goes to the central processing system and is processed. And when families use electronic signatures, the FSA ID, the FAFSA is usually processed within 48 to 72 hours. Once processed, it will send the process results back to the student, and it will send the process results to all of the colleges and universities listed on the FAFSA application. If after you have submitted the FAFSA form, you realize you need to add more schools, you will log back into the FAFSA website, go under corrections, and you can go to the add more schools tab and add more schools. If you made a mistake that you find out you made after you've submitted the FAFSA, you may go in and correct any of those mistakes. The school may ask you to document anything that you update or correct on the FAFSA form. But please keep in mind, you cannot update information on the FAFSA, such as assets and savings. It is captured at the point in time in which you submitted the FAFSA form. So if you go back to the question on cash savings and checking, for example, if you have an extra $2,000 in your account that is going to be used to pay off your credit card, do that before you submit the FAFSA so that you can say that on this date and time, you've captured what you have in cash savings and your assets, because those are not updatable. They're correctable if you can document that you made a mistake, but they are not updatable. This screen shows where the big red arrow goes, where you can find the make a correction link, as well as where you can view or print what we call the student aid report, which is the summary of the processed results of the FAFSA form. You do not need to send that to the colleges. However, when applying for certain scholarships, they may ask you to upload a copy of your student aid report for 22-23. And this is where you would print or view that student aid report. We do recognize that special circumstances may exist. And when you're filing the 22-23 FAFSA, again, you're using the 2020 tax information. If that information is no longer indicative of the family's income and support in the household, you may have what we call a special circumstance. And we recognize more now than ever because of the pandemic that there may be more unusual circumstances. So if the income has changed since 2020, you still need to submit the FAFSA as it directs with the 2020 taxable and untaxable income. And then you would reach out to the colleges and universities where you're submitting the FAFSA and explain your circumstances. Most schools use what is called an income appeal form or a special circumstance form, where the student would explain the special circumstance, provide documentation if appropriate. And if the college determines that that would make a difference in the student's eligibility, the school can reprocess the student's FAFSA using the information provided and potentially reduce that expected family contribution and increase the student's eligibility for financial aid. So the two most common ones that we tend to see are loss of child support, because you will report if you received child support in 2020, you have to report how much you received. But we understand that child support typically ends when a student turns 18 or graduates from high school. So with the proper documentation that child support has ended, we could use, for example, what was being received in 2021 on the FAFSA form. If the parent or student lost their job since 2020 or lost income or had a reduction in income, they would provide documentation of the loss of employment and the school could recalculate the EFC. So on this screen here are just examples of special circumstances that schools can consider. So you would reach out again to each college and university where you have submitted the FAFSA and discuss their appeal process for changes in special circumstances. Again, these are conditions that exist that cannot be documented on the FAFSA. The family will be requested to provide some type of written explanation and documentation to the college's financial aid office. The college will review it, request additional documentation if necessary, and make a final decision. The decision is at the discretion of the college and university and cannot be appealed to the Department of Education. So once the FAFSA is submitted and sent to the college, we may select you for a process called verification. FAFSAs are submitted to Federal Student Aid, and they randomly select certain FAFSAs for the schools to verify. This is not to pick on students and parents, and this is not any accusation that you may have purposely provided false information. This is just a random review of FAFSA forms just to make sure that families have provided the information accurately. So if you are selected for this process called verification, the college will reach out to you after they review your FAFSA and let the student know we need additional information and this is what we need. Usually it's a couple additional forms. If you were selected for a verification of income and you did not use data retrieval, we would ask for a signed copy of your 2020 federal tax return or a federal tax transcript. If you were selected to verify household size and number in college, there will be a form that the student will fill out that will actually list the people in their household and their relationship to the student, just to make sure that the household size and the number in college were provided correctly. Those are the two most common ones, but there could be additional requests for information that come from the college and university based on their need to verify the FAFSA form. Once verification is completed, or if a student's not selected for verification, then the college puts together a financial aid offer. Usually these offers are emailed to the students. So at many colleges, when a student applies for admission, they are assigned a college email account and they are assigned access to a college portal. If the student's school has that, they will be requested to activate that email account and check it on a regular basis. Most colleges will send an email to the student once their financial aid offer is available and direct the student to the school's portal to review their financial aid offer. And in that offer will include an amount of the aid awarded from each program, an explanation of how and when aid is dispersed to the student's account, as well as the terms and conditions of the student's award. So as I mentioned in the last slide, most colleges and universities use a school portal. It's an online resource that students can use to access to register for classes, view financial aid, and billing. Many schools do not send bills home to a student or to their parents. They will notify the student once they've registered for classes and billing has been turned on. They'll send an email to their school account and say, your financial aid is now viewable and your bill is now viewable. So everything gets directed to a portal as well as the school assigned email account. For those schools that use email assigned by the college, the students are required to activate and check it regularly, and it becomes the official mode of communication. The only way that the school will communicate with the student is through their school assigned email account, not through a personal email account. So students need to make sure that they have activated them and that they check them on a regular basis. Also, colleges communicate directly with the student and not the parent in most cases. Once a student enrolls in college, their college record, including academics and finances, become protected under the FERPA law, the Federal Education Right to Privacy Act. And students would need to give parents or guardians permission to access the information related to their academics and finances. So below is an example of a student information release on a school portal. So if the student wants the financial aid office or the billing office to be able to speak to their parent or guardian, the student would need to go into whatever the student information release form the school has and identify the person that they want the school to be able to speak to, as well as probably create an access code or a passcode that the parent or guardian would need to have when calling into the school's financial aid office. And we put this in this presentation because we want parents to be aware of this. We understand that parents in most cases are paying the student's bill. However, the FERPA law is very similar to HIPAA. And once the student enrolls, their record becomes protected under this. And we are limited in the information that we can share with parents and guardians over the phone unless the student has given us that authorization. This concludes the presentation on the FAFSA process and the financial aid process for the 2022-2023 financial aid year. Should you have any questions after reviewing this presentation, please feel free to reach out to the OASPA Outreach Committee at outreach@oaspa.org with your questions, and we will get back to you as soon as possible with any answers that we have for your questions.